So we're on the home stretch, the Olivet Discourse, Mark chapter 13. We've been walking our way through it very slowly, and now we come to the final lines. If you have not watched previous videos in this series, go back, check the video description below. You can find them all listed there. Watch these in order. We are building upon what has come before, and this is one of those things where you can't just piecemeal it. Otherwise, you end up pulling verses out of context. So that's why we've done this series, and that's my goal in finishing it, is to give you a full understanding of one of the last teaching blocks that Jesus gave in his earthly life. If you appreciate studies like this, in-depth biblical study, we would appreciate you subscribing if you haven't already. And lastly, since we don't have commercials that run in the middle of videos, at least hopefully we don't. I think I've turned those off. Let me know if you're still getting them. If you are, that's a YouTube thing, not a JM thing. But so just before we jump in, I got to say, Disciple Dojo, everything we do here is donor supported. Our monthly Disciple Dojo donors keep this thing going. We make a tiny bit from YouTube revenue. The bulk of what we do is from people who say, I appreciate this ministry enough and I want to help it grow, and they give on a monthly basis. So if you'd like to do that, well, here's the address right here where you can. I don't see any of that. Our board of directors, our finance director handle all donations. I don't know who gives what. I don't care who gives what. If you are a dojo donor, or you become a dojo donor on a monthly basis, use the contact form at the top of the website and send me a message. Check ministry from the drop-down options. If you check like finance or I think technological or something, those will go to either our guy who handles our website or our finance director. But if you click the ministry drop-down, that comes to me. So send me a message and just say, hey, JM, I'm a dojo donor and I would love to get one of the iron-on patches that you have. I would be happy to send you one of these as a little token of thank you. We've got either the light color or the dark color. You see me wearing these on some of the hats that I have here on the channel, but I'd love to get one of these to you in the mail. All you have to do is just send me an email through the website giving me your address and letting me know you're a donor. And I am super appreciative of your help. And then lastly, if you want to support and get something more than an iron-on patch in return, another way you can do that, check out our Disciple Dojo online store over at Zazzle. You can get like this track jacket I'm wearing that says keep calm and follow the lamb. We've also got some of our Old Testament timeline mugs. We've got t-shirts. We've got Bible nerd stuff, jujitsu nerd stuff. So check it out. All of that really helps. Okay, let's get back into the Olivet Discourse. So we finished with the last episode, verse 27, where we talked about the biblical importance of God's gathering Israel, or the elect who had been scattered. And we also saw how this was linked with the promises of a new covenant. So now in this section, Jesus is going to give two parables, one about a tree and one about a homeowner, an estate owner who goes away. So the first one, verse 28, he says, but learn the parable from the fig tree. And here's, you can see right here, clear as day, this is the word parabole. Learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branch already becomes tender and puts forth leaves, know that the harvest is near. Common knowledge in a world where they're familiar with fig trees. We'll look at that in just a second. Verse 29, and thus you, humes, and this should be, if I wanted to be technical, I'd change this to y'all once again. This is plural. And thus y'all, when y'all see these, keep this word in mind, tauta, know, and this is an imperative, you or y'all know that near is at the door. Now there's a little bit of a word play here that you can't translate this into English, but right up here in the parable of the fig tree, he says, when the fig tree, ekfue tafula, like leaves, puts forth leaves, genoskete, hati angus, so know that near, hati, that angus, near, so know that near, tatheros estin, tatheros, and that's just the word for the time of harvest. In the next verse, there's a kind of parallel. He says, when you see these happening, genoskete, know hati angus, that near estin epi thurais. So harvest is theros, and at the door is epithurais. So a little bit of a word play. These two words in English sound nothing alike, and so you can't carry that through. And then to underscore that he is being serious. He says, Lego humin, I say to you that ume, absolutely not. It will pass, or it will pass away, this generation, this genea. Mechris, until hu tauta panta genetai, which, or this is a relative pronoun, until that which panta tauta. These are going to happen, all these, and they're going to happen before this generation passes away. And some people have tried to translate this, and there's even a footnote in the old NIV that says this could be translated as race, like a race of people. That is possible in some contexts, but that is never how it's translated in the Synoptic Gospels. To my knowledge, I don't know of a single time, and especially when it's this generation. It's always, whenever Jesus refers to this generation, this adulterous generation, he's always talking about his contemporaries. He's never talking about the Jewish race. I mean, how would you even define that? Would that include Samaritans? Would that include Galileans? Or is he just talking about Judeans? Just this concept of race even is a modern concept to begin with. So I don't know of anyone except certain people that are trying to prop up their end times view that the Olivet Discourse is talking about only the end of the world. I don't know of anybody that would say that's how this is naturally translated in this section. So he says, truly I say to you, this generation won't pass away until all these tauta panta happen. The sky and the earth will pass away. We've seen heaven and earth language already. They will pass away, or they may pass away. He might be speaking subjunctive, but the sky and the heaven, like this creation will pass away. Hologoi mu, my words will not pass away. Now, the only thing in all of existence that could be said to not pass away is, of course, God. But we won't get into all of the Trinitarian implications for that in this. Just know that Jesus is saying everything that you know could go wrong or could pass away or could come to an end, but my words are eternal. You can take it to the bank, we might say. So this is the first parable, but he's not done. He'll say, now concerning that day or hour, no one knows. And this is where he switches, peride, changing subjects. So he said, these are going to happen within this generation, and this is how you can know, and just like with the fig tree, that's knowable. Peride, now concerning tes hemeres ekenes, that day, etes horas, or hour. So he is switching subjects, and he says, no one knows. Not the angeloi in Uranu, not the messengers in heaven, angels, nor the Son, presumably the Son of Man who was just coming on the clouds of glory in the previous section. The Son doesn't even know, only the Father. So if nobody knows, what should they do? Well, exactly how he began the discourse. Blepete, watch. Agrupnete, stay awake or keep watch. For you do not know pote, when, hakairos estin, the kairos is. Kairos means special time, appointed time. One of my professors in seminary used to say, think of it as like pregnant time. Like it's something, it's not just time, like chronos is time. Kairos is like the time we've been waiting for, or a special time. And Jesus is saying you don't know when, no one knows when that's going to be. And then he gives another parable. Like a man being away on a journey, leaves his house, and he gives, dous tois doulos autou, he gives to his servants or his slaves, ten exousion, authority. Ekasto to ergon autou, each with his job or his work, his task, and the doorkeeper, enetelato hina gregore. He commanded that he keep watch. Man goes away, leaves the slaves of his estate in charge, each with their task. The gardener's going to garden, the sweeper's going to sweep, the cook's going to cook. All the people have their jobs to keep the household running. And the doorkeeper, he is going to keep watch. That's his job. So that's the parable. So Jesus says, Gregorete un, you keep watch, y'all keep watch, therefore, for you do not know pote, there's the word again that was right up here in verse 33, when the appointed time is, be awake, for you don't know when, hakurias tes oikas erkatai, the Lord of the house returns. eopse, e mesanuktion, e electrophonias, that's a fun word, e proi. So you don't know when the Lord of the manor, the Lord of the house is coming back. Could be an evening, could be middle of the night, could be at the crowing. That's literally what this means, a rooster giving voice. Or it could be morning. Lest he comes suddenly and finds y'all sleeping. So that's the parable. And then Jesus closes with this word, hadehumen lego passen lego. What to y'all I say to everyone, gregorete, keep awake, keep watch, stay up. So that is how the discourse ends. Now, there are a number of terms that are important, but first of all, remember what the disciples began the discourse by asking. All the way back up in verse 4, what did they ask him? They said, tell us, pote, when, tauta este, these will be. And hotan, another way to say when, and when, about to be tauta, these fulfilled, panta, all. And I should underline panta there. I forgot to do that. So tauta, panta, pote, hotan. Tell us when, these, all these. That's how the discourse started. Well, when we get to this part, I pointed this out again. The parable of the fig tree, he says, hotan, the branch becomes tender, it puts forth leaves. Know that tauta, these are about to happen. And then again, I tell you the truth, this generation won't pass away until tauta panta. All these have happened. So it is inescapable that what Jesus' disciples were asking him about, he told them it was going to happen before they passed away, before that generation passed away. And that's why everything he's saying throughout the discourse, he's saying y'all, you, yous guys, yins, whatever you want to say it. He's talking to them. He's not saying 2,000 years later, somebody reading this in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Seattle, Washington. He's not saying that. He's talking to them. So this is the main reason why you cannot read the Olivet Discourse as only talking about things happening at the end of the world. It has to primarily be about what was going to happen in that generation. And as we've seen in previous videos in this series, Jesus nailed it. That is exactly what happened in his generation. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, clearly then you have not watched this series and are just jumping in on this one. So go back and watch those, because this, I think, is beyond arguing for anybody who's followed along in this series. We don't need to beat this dead horse anymore. So he's already talked about tauta panta, all these, but then he shifts gears here with this peride, now concerning tes hemeres ekenes, that day. Now, we saw in previous episodes when he talked about the day of the Lord that was coming upon Jerusalem, it was usually in the plural, those days. But the Old Testament also had a concept of the day of the Lord that was kind of like rebounding throughout history. And so it would apply at different points at different times, because it was a way of talking about God's judgment on an earthly empire or an earthly power or an earthly city being overthrown. That was how you would describe a day of the Lord. Well, the understanding was there was always coming a final day, a capital D day of the Lord, that all of the previous days of the Lord that happened throughout history were foreshadowing or leading up to. He's talked about the day of the Lord, small d, that's going to happen to Jerusalem. And now he says concerning that day, tes hemeras ekenes. Now Jesus is pointing beyond the horrors of 70 AD to the final day of the Lord, the consummation, the parousia. And that parousia, unlike the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds to the Ancient of Days, the enthronement, this is when, pote, the coming of the Lord of the household in this parable world, that's the coming of the Son of Man, vertical, coming down. This would be what Paul's talking about in 1 Thessalonians 4, about meeting the Lord in the air at his return, and then, welcoming him back as the king of all of the universe, taking his seat on his throne here on this earth where he reigns and rules, etc. So this would be talking about the parousia. And that's different than what was talked about with the parable of the fig tree, which is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So, for example, France says in that phrase, this generation will not pass away before all these things have happened. You know, a lot of interpreters, like Albert Schweitzer and others, said, yeah, Jesus thought he was going to come back. The world was going to end. Paul thought that. I even get commenters on YouTube saying, well, Paul clearly believed Jesus was going to return and he was wrong. All the disciples believed Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. They were all wrong. And because Jesus said he was going to return in their lifetime and Jesus was wrong. That's not an uncommon thing to hear, even in biblical scholarship circles. It's just incorrect, though. Hopefully this whole series has showed you why that reading is both simplistic and non-historical. France says, if it weren't for the embarrassment which it causes those who think Jesus is here talking about the Parousia, his return, and so got it wrong, this verse would have posed no great problems. And this verse is verse 30. That's what he's talking about here. This generation won't pass away until all these things have happened. He says its language is clear and definite, not now in symbols, but in straightforward statement of a time limit. It is, moreover, emphatic and authoritative. Here, the whole construction of the sentence, as well as the disciples' question, when, in verse 4, demands the regular temporal sense. People alive, as Jesus is speaking, will still be there to see the fulfillment of his words. Everything about the fig tree becoming tender, putting forth leaves, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, all of that, everything that Jesus has been saying, the tribulation, it'll be terrible. Pray that it doesn't happen during the winter, or that you're not nursing at the time, like all of that. And so France goes on to say there's clear continuity between the question when mele tauta sunt telestai panta, when all of these are about to be fulfilled, and the answer that this generation will not pass away until tauta panta genetai. All these happen. If the former phrase, this, referred to the destruction of the temple, and as we've seen, nothing in its context suggests any other reference, then so must the latter. Tauta panta, in this context, must therefore refer to the whole complex of events Jesus has been predicting in verses 14 through 27, all of the discourse so far. The answer to the disciples' question is thus comprehensively rounded off by as plain and definite a time scale as they could have wished for. This generation will not pass away before all these things have happened. It's as clear as an answer as they could have asked for. And LePau notes how people have misread this, and he says, this verse has been central to those who, like Albert Schweitzer, thought Jesus was a failed prophet. As they read Mark 13, Jesus said he would come back within a generation, but he didn't. N.T. Wright solves this problem by viewing Mark 13, 24 through 27 as also being about the destruction of the temple, not about a second coming. This is Christ's vindication in heaven, not a return to earth, regarding his death, resurrection, defeat of death and Satan, and his true prophecy about the temple. So LePau is noting that, Wright, in correcting Schweitzer and others who said Jesus got it wrong, has said, no, this is all 13, 24 through 27 has all been about the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Jesus is saying. This generation won't pass away before it takes place. LePau goes on to add, we can also resolve the dilemma by placing Mark 13:30, and again, that's this line, truly I say to y'all, this generation won't pass away until all these happen, in a section concerning the temple, not the coming of the Son of Man. So LePau is suggesting you can even still read coming of the Son of Man as referring to Jesus's return, which is how he does, and that not being the same thing as the destruction of the temple. In other words, you don't have to take N.T. Wright's reading of the coming of the Son of Man was talking about 70 AD. You can even say that that's talking about something that happens later and still get the same basic idea that in verse 30, he is talking only about the destruction of the temple. Saying that no one knows the day does not contradict Jesus' saying in verse 29 that we can know when it is near, because that concerned the destruction of the temple, not the coming of the Son of Man, which is in view here. And so basically LePau saying you can say that this generation won't pass away until all these happen. That's referring again to the temple being destroyed. That's what they can know when that's about to happen. Like you can know that. You can know when Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. In fact, the entire discourse doesn't make any sense if you couldn't know when the day of the Lord in that sense was about to happen, because otherwise you wouldn't see the abomination of desolation and all the stuff that's like Jerusalem surrounded by armies and the eagles and vultures gathering. It's time to get out. None of that would make any sense if you couldn't know about that. So that's what Jesus is saying is going to happen and you can know about. Then when he says now concerning that day, no one knows, he's switched. He's now not talking about the destruction of the temple anymore. People like, I think N.T. Wright or others who say Jesus is still talking about the destruction of the temple in verse 32 is being more literal. Like you won't know the day or the hour, but you can know something's near without knowing the day or hour that it's going to happen when Jerusalem is actually going to be destroyed, for instance. So both ways you can make sense of this without having to just push everything off into the future and make the Olivet Discourse completely meaningless to its original audience. So the fig tree part, the first parable, learn this parable from the fig tree. And what is it? When already its branch becomes tender and puts forth leaves, you know that harvest is near. That's it. That's what Jesus is saying. You know about fig trees. Well, we may not know about fig trees, so Lane helps us out. He says, in contrast to most of the trees of Palestine, the olive, the oak, evergreen, terebinth, the fig loses its leaves in the winter. And in contrast to the almond, which blossoms very early in the spring, the fig tree shows signs of life only later. Only as it gets closer does the fig tree then put forth its leaves. Jesus' parable appeals to this particularity. When the branches of the fig become softened by sap flowing through them and the leaves begin to appear, one can be certain that winter is past. It's a phrase used in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2. And the warm season is very near. So agriculturally, that's what people knew. When the fig tree starts to put forth leaves, summer's right around the corner. The parable relates the sprouting of the fig tree and the summer in terms of a beginning point and its inevitable sequence. When the fig tree becomes green, one is not only certain that summer is coming, but that it's near. The Mount of Olives was famous for its fig trees, which sometimes attained a height of 20 or 30 feet. Assuming that Jesus gave this instruction just before Passover, the fig tree would be in the condition described in the parable. Its branches tender, its leaves sprouting, like he would have said, look around at the fig trees right now. By calling the disciples to observe properly what was immediately at hand, the fig trees around them, Jesus reinforced his exhortation to observe what was happening in Jerusalem and Judea and to recognize its significance. Look around at the temple. Look around at all of what's happening. Look around right now. And Jesus has used the fig tree before for parable purposes. When he cursed the fig tree, may you never bear fruit again, and then the next day the tree's withered. Jesus doesn't hate figs. That whole thing was an enacted parable because the fig tree was the spiritual state of Jerusalem, that it should have been bearing fruit. It looked as if it was ready to bear fruit, and Jesus curses it. Very prophetic act for the upcoming fate of Jerusalem. But Lane picks up on, he's one of the ones that picks up on this periday language, back up in verse 32, when he shifts gears and says, now concerning that day. Lane says, it's necessary to give full force to the adversative particle, and that's periday, in verse 32. As for that day and hour, on the contrary, that's how he would translate it, no one knows. While the parable of the fig tree illustrates the possibility of observing the proximity of the first event, destruction of Jerusalem, another comparison now is developed in connection with verse 32, which underscores the impossibility of knowing the moment of the Lord's return. Verses 30 and 32 concern two distinct events: the taking of Jerusalem by the Romans and the day of the Lord, respectively. And by day of the Lord, Lane uses day of the Lord to mean final day of the Lord, the return, the Parousia. And France agrees. He picks up on the same emphasis of the periday, now concerning. He says this represents a change of focus from the language about the coming of the Son of Man, not the Parousia, but the coming of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days, in verse 26, which is a theologically loaded way of describing the significance of what happened in 70 AD. So France agrees with N.T. Wright that coming of the Son of Man from Daniel is describing not the coming back of the Son of Man, but the coming before the Ancient of Days of the Son of Man. France agrees with Wright on that, or he disagrees with Wright as he says, but in now Jesus turns and addresses the coming back of the Son of Man. He says, while the plural hehemere ekene has been used several times to describe the period of the siege of Jerusalem, so this is in those days, and it's been used in verse 17, 19, 20, and 24. No singular day, hemeras, has been mentioned, which provides a suitable antecedent to he hemere ekene in verse 32. Moreover, the statement of ignorance concerning this day or hour contrasts strongly with the resounding certainty of Jesus' pronouncement of the time within which the tauta, these, described in the previous verses, will occur. We've moved emphatically from the known to the unknown. So Francis is saying the parable of the fig tree is talking about something that can very easily be known. And in fact, it has to be known so you can act on it to get out of Jerusalem. That coming of the Son of Man is the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's certain. Verses 30 and 31, Jesus makes it clear it's going to happen. And it's going to happen to their generation. But then when he says, peride, now concerning, then in verse 32, the disciples aren't even thinking in this way because they didn't think Jesus was going to go anywhere. He'd always told them, yeah, I'm going to be killed. The Son of Man is going to be crucified. God's going to raise him up. And the disciples were always like, okay, whatever. They didn't really get it. Which is why when he died, what did they do? They didn't sit around and go, okay, now let's wait for him to come back like he promised. No, they were dejected. They mourned. They wept. They walked on the road to Emmaus thinking we thought would be the one. They were crushed. They had no expectation of Jesus actually returning from death. But Jesus did. And this, France and others are saying, is how he loads it into the Olivet Discourse when he shifts from the answer to their question, 70 AD, that's when it's going to happen. The coming of the Son of Man, the authority of the Son of Man before all the beastly nations is going to be solidified. Jerusalem is going to be judged just like Edom, Babylon, Assyria, Jerusalem in Jeremiah's day. That's all going to have happened in 70 AD. And then at the tail end, Jesus tacks on, this is where Wright and others don't agree and they don't follow to this point. But I actually think France is right on this. This is one of the places where I disagree with N.T. Wright, who I have nothing but profoundest respect for. I do think Jesus does what France says he's doing, which is pointing them now beyond their question to that day. And Jesus is talking about his parousia. And so we have moved from the known, what Jesus says his disciples can know, the destruction of Jerusalem, to the unknown, what no one can know. So he continues, it seems then that in early Christian parlance, that day, or even just the day, singular, was in itself a recognized eschatological term where the context allowed. Like when somebody said that day, if the subject of the discussion is eschatology or prophecy or something like that, to say that day carries connotation. Now, if somebody just said, what day are we going to go? Oh, we're going to go on that day. In everyday conversation, it doesn't always have that weight. So you can't just, every time you see that day, you can't say, it's talking about the day of the Lord. But if the context is theologically loaded, then it's very likely that that's what it's talking about. An example that may help this in English, I'm stealing this from our friend Jason Staples because I think it's a great example. In everyday language, if I say the word inconceivable, that just means inconceivable. But if I say it in a certain way, like inconceivable, everybody that's ever seen The Princess Bride knows that I'm being very ironic in how I use it because I'm quoting Vizzini from The Princess Bride, even though it's just, So anyway, context determines. If you're a fan of Always Sunny in Philadelphia, if I said because of the implications with like a weird evil look in my eye, you would know I'm quoting Dennis from Always Sunny, and you would know that this is talking about something that's very disturbing just because of his tone in that scene. If you don't know what I'm talking about, clearly we don't share that background, and so you would miss it. But every Always Sunny fan knows immediately when I say the implications. You know what I'm talking about. So it's kind of like that with the day or that day. You can almost see like that day, wink, wink, or the day. So anyway, Mark could thus expect his readers to detect in the use of this phrase a shift from the historical events of the Jewish war, 70 AD, to a more ultimate perspective without having to spell it out. So when Mark says now concerning that day, his Jewish readers would have been like, oh, day of the Lord, big time day of the Lord, like capital D, day of the Lord. So he says the parousia, that's the return of Jesus. The parousia is by no means an irrelevant subject to add on to the discourse, particularly when there is such a clear and important temporal distinction to be drawn between the two events. The one, a historical judgment to take place within the generation, the other, an unknown day for which one must always be ready, but for which one can never set a date. Always be ready, but you can't set a date. This is why every doomsday cult gets it wrong, by the way. Because the question that Wright and others would raise is, if the disciples were asking about Jesus's coming to power, and when he was going to when you're going to rule Jerusalem. I mean, that would have been what they were asking as they're looking around, and Jesus says, oh, this is actually all going to be destroyed. And they'd be like, in their minds, thinking, well, Jesus is probably going to do something or be the one even that leads to its destruction in some way in overthrowing Rome and setting up his kingdom and the war that was going to happen. And, just all those expectations that, as we've seen, Jesus's followers weren't the only ones who were looking for that. The Essenes were looking for it. The other intertestamental Jewish groups were looking for it. The Sadducees were terrified of it because they liked the status quo with Rome. So, people might say, so why would Jesus, in answering their question about what's going to happen with the destruction of the temple, why then would he jump ahead and introduce a talk about the Parousia and about his return when, again, they don't even think he's going anywhere necessarily? And the reason is because, and I think France makes a great point here, he says, while the period preceding the destruction of the temple, like the wars and rumors of wars and all that Jesus had described, while that period will call for a cool, level-headed refusal to become excited too soon, and get on board with the zealots or any of the other groups and thinking, oh, now God's going to finally come and bring justice. And, remember, Jesus was like, no, God has abandoned this temple complex. Get out. He will not save you. That's what Jesus wants them to think about 70 AD, and they did for the most part. But when it comes to his return, he wants the opposite. He wants constant readiness. Unlike the thoroughly predictable end of the temple, the time of Jesus' parousia is known only to God. Even the Son himself, who might most have been expected to share the secret, doesn't know. The situation calls, therefore, not for calculation of dates or careful observation of signs, looking at you, John Hagee, but for constant readiness. That's what is needed when we're talking about the return of Jesus. Not trying to look up blood moons that are coming, not trying to keep an eye on Jerusalem. It's the epicenter of God's prophetic timetable. Not any of that nonsense, because we cannot know when he's going to return. He could have returned then. He didn't need to wait for the gospel to reach satellite to every country in the world. No, the gospel had already gone out to the four corners of the earth by the first century. When Paul, we saw in previous episodes, when Paul said the whole world had heard, the gospel had been preached to all creation, the gospel had already done it. Jesus could have come back at any moment. He didn't have to wait for Jerusalem to be recaptured by modern Israel. He didn't have to wait for 1948. He didn't have to wait for 1967. He doesn't have to wait for anything that has to do with Hamas. He doesn't have to wait for anything that has to do with Iran or Russia. None of that. He could come back right now before I finish filming this video, and there will be no signs that predict it. The signs were to predict and to get ready for the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And that's what Jesus' followers paid attention to. And that's why they, for the most part, weren't in Jerusalem when it happened. But people conflate the two in the discourse. And so they start reading things about the signs and then the coming of the Son of Man and then the return of the absentee Lord to his household. And they just read it all as one thing and say, oh, we've got to look for these signs. And that's where you get the blood moon nonsense. I love how LePeau says this in his commentary. He said, if Jesus had wanted the disciples to be able to create a prophecy chart when he finished his discourse on the Mount of Olives, he would have been much clearer. Rather, his point is something else. Be alert, be on guard, watch out, preach the gospel, persevere, be ready for hard times. Why? Because in Mark 13, Jesus is not only telling the disciples to be on guard and watchful regarding what will happen 30 years later, he also gives them warning for what will happen in the next few days. These are all the phrases, and LePeau has cataloged some of these. All of these phrases Jesus has used throughout the discourse, and I've been kind of noting them as we go. All of these happen in the next two chapters to Jesus. Jesus' disciples, whom he had said, these are my true brothers. When people said, your family's here, he's like, who's my family but the ones who fought? Like, they were his brothers. One of them betrayed him. In the very next chapter, after this, chapter 14. So brother will betray brother. Yeah, that's Jesus is like, it's going to happen to you because it happens to me. The idea of don't be found asleep, but keep watch, stay awake. Those terms that we looked at, they're used next chapter. I'm deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake. Verse 34 uses the same terminology. When he came, he found them sleeping. That's exactly what he warned against in the second parable about the returning Lord, is lest he come and find you sleeping. Jesus does this repeatedly in the next chapter. He comes and finds them sleeping. So what does he tell them? Verse 38, stay awake. He said things like, you'll be handed over. You'll be beaten in the synagogues. You'll be brought to trial. You'll be brought before and stood before kings and governors, and you'll give testimony. That's exactly what Jesus does in the very next chapter. 46, they took hold of him and arrested him. 53, they led Jesus away. 65, they beat him and slapped him. Chapter 15, verse 1, when it was morning, having held a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, the chief priest tied Jesus up, led him away, and handed him over to Governor Pilate. And this is after in other Gospels he was taken to Herod, kings and governors. Jesus was stood before both. His followers will stand before both. Remember, Jesus said, many will come in my name saying, I am. And he told his followers, when you're brought to trial, don't worry about what you're going to say beforehand. Say whatever is given to you. He talked about the coming of the Son of Man. He talked about the sun will be darkened. These are all the things that were going to happen in and around 70 AD. Well, they happened also in the very next chapter. 1460, the high priest stood up before them all and questioned Jesus. Don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? Testifying, martyr. But he kept silent and did not answer. He didn't worry about what to say. The Spirit will give what's needed to be said. Again, the high priest questioned him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus says, I am. Ego eimi. He's the only one that can make this statement and it not be false. And then he adds to it, he connects the dots. Jesus said, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. You will see it, high priest, Sanhedrin. He's not talking about something that's going to happen 2,000 years later. He's talking about what they're going to live to see, the destruction of Jerusalem, and they will live to see it. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What's your decision? They all condemned him as deserving death. They rightly understood he's making two claims here. His claim of ego eimi, I am, he's at very least invoking the divine name. At the very least, he's using the name of the Lord in vain, breaking the commandment. And then when he says, you will see, and he says, the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, he's applying Daniel 7 language and basically saying, you are the beasts. You're the beasts that the Son of Man is going to come and vanquish. And they get it. They rightly understand him. And then what happens in the 2 chapters later, in 15, after he's crucified, when it was noon, middle of the day, darkness came over the whole land. The sun was darkened. This time, literally. And then when Jesus talks about, now about that day or hour, and he uses the hora, the hour, even that language is sprinkled in the next chapter. He went a little further, fell to the ground, this is in Gethsemane, fell to the ground and prayed, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. The hour, he's not talking about just 1 hour, 60 minutes. He's talking about that hour. And so Jesus's hour came, his end of his life. The disciples too he wants to prepare them to always be ready for their hour, their own persecution, just like Jesus. A couple of verses later, after he came and saw them that they were sleeping again, he says, enough. I think this is CSB I pulled from, but some translations say the time has come. Literally, it says the hour has come. The hora has come. And then when Jesus talked about in the parable, when the Lord of the house might return, it could be evening, it could be the middle of the night, it could be at the crowing, very specific term, or it could be in morning. 3 of these 4 terms are found in the text in the next chapter, and one of them is very close. So midnight is mezonukti, and nukti would just be night, middle of the night. So even the one that's not exactly parallel is really close. So 14:17, when evening came, he arrived with the 12. 14:30, truly I tell you, Jesus said to him, today, this very night, before the rooster crows, twice, you will deny me 3 times. And then 15:1, as soon as it was morning, he was let out. So Jesus's life is going to be a microcosm of what his followers are going to experience as well. His passion narrative is going to become, in a broader sense, the passion narrative of his followers in their own lives and settings and as they look to the future. So LePeau says 3 times Jesus has emphasized that the way of the Messiah was one of suffering. He did it in Mark 8, he did it in Mark 9, and then did it in Mark 10. Mark lays out another threefold progression of suffering from John the messenger, so John the Baptist, and that's we read about in chapter 1 and chapter 6, to Jesus the master, chapter 1, chapter 8, 9, and 10, to the disciples, chapter 3, chapter 8, chapter 13. Threefold patterns of those who are going to suffer. The one like Elijah who is to come, he's going to suffer. He did. He got beheaded. The Lord himself, he's going to suffer. He got crucified. And therefore, why should followers of Jesus expect any different? And that's what Mark's preparing them for. Each was called to preach, and each was then delivered up. This is discipleship, being prepared so we can be faithful. That's the importance of the Olivet Discourse. So what does any of this have to do with us today then? I mean, yeah, okay, that's what he was telling his original disciples. And they were prepared. They weren't in Jerusalem when it fell. They had gotten out. They spread the gospel. They planted churches. They baptized. They fulfilled the Great Commission. I have a YouTube channel here today telling you about all of this because of these faithful martyrs. But what does that have to do with any of us? Well, there's always future application to the events in history. God is the author of history, and you see patterns, you see types and antitypes, you see prophetic words that then are fulfilled in a newer or an even greater degree later. LePeau gives an example. Old Testament prophecies can have an immediate fulfillment in their original context, but they can also have further fulfillments. For example, Isaiah gave King Ahaz a sign of victory in battle. This is all the way back in Isaiah chapter 7. Isaiah gave King Ahaz, he said, this is a sign that you're going to win this battle. A son will be born to an Alma, whether you want to translate that as a virgin or as a young maiden, doesn't matter for Isaiah's setting. A son is going to be born, and he's going to be called Emmanuel. That was the sign that Isaiah gave to King Ahaz. Well, Matthew looks back and sees that, oh, what was just a sign, a prophetic sign in Isaiah's day, Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that. Because that kid in Isaiah's day was just going to be named Emmanuel, with us God. But this kid born in Bethlehem is literally Emmanuel. He is going to, his name's not going to be Emmanuel. Jesus, nobody ever called Jesus Emmanuel, by the way. Matthew's not saying that that's a prediction of a boy in the first century who would be born and be named Emmanuel, because that'd be a failed prediction. Jesus wasn't named Emmanuel. Jesus was Emmanuel. You see the difference? The way I like to think of it is, okay, you can either think of like prophecy recapitulating throughout history and, you know, it has a fulfillment at this point, and then that it has an even greater fulfillment at this time, but it still meant this at this time. And then there may be even a future fulfillment. I think that's a perfectly valid way of looking at it. It's called recapitulation. I think another way that might be helpful is think of prophecy fulfilled as a square to a cube. So if a square is announced, like I'm going to draw a square, and then I draw a square, like 4 sides, okay, I have a square. That square, if I extrapolate it into another dimension, so this is the 2 dimensions. If I extrapolate that square into the 3rd dimension, I now have a cube. And the cube is bigger than the square could ever be. And it's beyond what anybody who lived in a 2-dimensional world, a flatlander. But if you've never read the book Flatland, by the way, it's phenomenal. Read it. Just, it's awesome. A flatlander would look at the square and they'd see a square. Somebody who could look from a 3rd dimension would see the square extrapolated, and it's a cube. And so they're seeing a whole dimension to it. The square's still there. It doesn't negate the existence of the square. It's not like a square was predicted and now we're going to make a sphere. No, it's still going to be a square, but it's a square at a higher dimension. To me, that's a little bit better way of thinking about how prophecy can have multiple fulfillments. What was talked about as a day of the Lord is still a day of the Lord in history. Judgment on Babylon, judgment on Edom, judgment on Jerusalem. That's still the square day of the Lord. But the day of the Lord, capital D day of the Lord, extrapolated out to a higher dimension, and now it's an even fuller, oh, you can see how that day of the Lord was just one component of what the ultimate day of the Lord's going to be. If you want to be math nerdy, you can do the same thing with a cube versus a hypercube and 4D space. It's an analogy. Don't press this for literalism, but just as a way of getting you to see what LaPoe and others are talking about. We know that Jesus is now giving something bigger. He is expanding it into another dimension because he tells his disciples. He's still talking to Peter, James, John, and Andrew, the four of them. In verse 37, the end of the discourse, he says, what I say to you, y'all, and I'm going to actually change this because I just saw that this will rhyme perfectly. Another reason why everybody should speak Southern. What I say to y'all, I say to all, keep watch. Keep watch over what? Keep watch for that day or hour, that appointed time that you don't know when it is. So you gotta blepete. You've got to keep watch. He is the one extrapolating it to future people. He is the one saying, you're going to live and see the nightmares of 70 AD. Most of you. Some of you will be dead. I mean, some of them would not survive to see 70 AD. But that generation, he's talking to them and to the people in Jerusalem. Yeah, you're going to be around for this. But what I'm telling you about this parable, Lord of the household going away, leaving his servants, this phrase, giving to his servants power or authority, however you translate exousia. That's the last thing Jesus did before he ascended. This is highly pregnant language for the disciples, and I don't think it's an accident. The inspired author of Mark, I think, is doing this intentionally because Jesus' message to the y'all, to his disciples, has application to everyone, everywhere, when it comes to that day or hour. Not the square, but the cube. And so even N.T. Wright, like I said, N.T. Wright reads all of Jesus talking about just 70 A.D. And Wright would say that even the landlord going away and then coming back, he would even apply that to 70 A.D., I think, unless he's changed over the years. Wright can still say it points beyond itself. He says parousia means presence as opposed to apousia, which means absence. Hence, it denotes the arrival of someone, not at the moment present. So when somebody says, oh, the president's going to be coming through this town and going to appear at this mall at this time for what, that will be the president's parousia. And so what we'll do, Secret Service will go in, they'll get ready, people will get ready, everybody will prepare, things will clean up, they'll try to put a spin on it, whether they like the president, whether they hate the president, depending on who's the president. People will get ready for that parousia. That's how the term is used in scripture. And so the parousia, capital P, refers to Jesus's return. And Wright says that's going to happen in the future. Jesus is going to return. Wright doesn't think that Mark 13 is about the parousia, but he thinks that certainly 1 Thessalonians 4 is about it. And this is what he said. It's also important for us to remind ourselves of our own call to watch, to be alert. The judgment that fell on the temple is a foretaste, according to other passages in the New Testament, of the judgment that will fall on the whole world. So even though Wright and others can read Mark 13 as in a preterist way, describing events that have already happened, they say, but elsewhere in the New Testament, we know that those events of 70 AD foreshadow, point forward to, prefigure the events that are going to happen when Jesus returns. This time, there are to be no signs, despite the regular attempts to speculate on such things, no advanced warnings. Just the ongoing command to God's people in Christ to be faithful to him, not to compromise with the standards and fashions of the present age, but to keep awake, watching, as Paul says again, for the day to dawn, in whose light the dim flickering candles of the present age will be needed no more. That's what the Olivet Discourse is meant to give us. Not meant to give us attempts to speculate, not meant to give us, I've got a whole shelf here of prophecy charts and timelines and nonsense of pop eschatology and late great planet Earth and all of that. None of that is what Jesus intended to give us. The Olivet Discourse was not intended to give us that. What it was intended to give us, just the ongoing command to God's people in Christ. Be faithful to him. Don't compromise. Keep awake. Watch for the day to dawn. So that's the relevance of the Olivet Discourse that we've been looking at these past, I don't know what we're on now. I think this is part 11. That's the relevance. Jesus told his disciples then what would happen in a way that would let his disciples throughout all time know what to expect in general when it comes to suffering and persecution, that they would follow the way of the master, and to specifically let them know that they can't predict when he would return. That's the irony of people, pop eschatology experts, using the Olivet Discourse to try to plan out end times timetables. That's the irony. They're doing exactly what it was not intended people to use it for. Maybe I didn't convince you of it. I don't know. Hopefully this was helpful. Those of you that have asked, some have asked, they said, I can't watch this whole thing. I lose track. Are you saying Jesus has returned already? One, you can watch it and you can focus and you can take in more content than TikTok and sound bites. And then if you completely disagree and think I'm spouting nonsense, that's perfectly fine. But you can engage this stuff. This type of Bible study is not for the elite. It's not for the special. It's not for those with hidden knowledge or the super spiritual. This is just normal Bible study. So you can grasp it. But for those of you that are just so impatient or anxious, like, what is this guy teaching? Is he saying that Jesus has already returned? Is he a full preterist? No, Jesus has not already returned. And if anyone tells you there he is, look over there, he's in here, don't believe them. They are a false Messiah. When Jesus returns, no one will have to ask if Jesus was returned or not. That's the bottom line. He is coming back. Apostolic Christianity, don't listen to the hyper-preterists or even just the misguided cage stage preterists that say, yeah, and all the stuff about Jesus' return, it's all already happened. No, apostolic Christianity has always said he ascended into heaven and sitteth at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there, he shall come to judge the quick and the dead, or the living and the dead. He shall come to judge. Jesus has not returned. He is going to return. And when he returns, some people are going to be asleep. The message of the Olivet Discourse is don't be one of them. Be awake, be alert, be ready to suffer. Don't pin your hopes on any eschatological timetable or any nationalistic hopes of God defending his temple, his city, even his country, in this case in the Middle East, or any of that stuff. Whether it's Israel in the Middle East or America today, neither of those are God's country. Neither of those are God's people collectively. So don't pin your eschatological anxiety on what is going on who's in the White House or who's in the Knesset, on what Russia is doing or what China is doing or what Iran is doing. Don't pin there's always going to be wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation. There's going to be earthquakes in various places. Why? Because all that stuff led up to 70 AD, and all those kind of things have continued to happen ever since 70 AD. And that's not what the Olivet Discourse is giving information about for us today to factor in. The parable of the fig tree was not a parable for modern 20th century readers. It was a parable for that generation. The parable of the absent homeowner who will return and who in the meantime has given power to his servants with their different tasks to keep the thing going, and the doorkeeper to keep watch and to keep alert. That's the parable that has direct application to you and to me just as much as it did to the first audience. Throughout this study, I've read and looked at a number of other commentaries, but kind of the ones that I've grabbed quotes from and walked through on the screen because I thought they were the most representative, and sometimes I thought they were the best on this particular passage. It's basically 4 commentaries and 1 book. So for instance, William Lane, those came from his NICNT series. Now this is not William Lane's, this is Howard Marshall's on John's letters, but it's because I don't have a hard copy of Lane's. I have it in my Accordance library, but this is the series that Lane's is in. So if you see the one that looks like this is NICNT. So Lane did the one on Mark in this series. Morna Hooker did Mark's in the Black's New Testament commentary series. Those look like this, and this actually is that volume because I do have it hard copy. The quotes from N.T. Wright came from not a commentary, but his book, Jesus and the Victory of God. This was a landmark book. This is part of his bigger set of the Christian Origins series. They're all excellent. I have them all behind me down there. I would recommend every volume in this series that Wright did. But this one, his section on the Olivet Discourse, this is the best presentation of the view that Wright takes, that others have taken as well, that I've come across. This was a game changer for me when I read this 20 years ago in seminary. Then R.T. France in the NIGTC, New International Greek Testament Commentary. They look like this. This is not France's volume. This is Thistleton's volume on 1 Corinthians. But again, I have France's volume digitally. I don't have the hard copy, but it looks like this, the set that looks like this. That's what R.T. France is on Mark. France also did the volume on Matthew in this series as well. So you can check out the NICNT Matthew volume that France did, or the NIGTC Mark volume that France did, or I would say read both because they're both good. And then lastly, LaPoe. The quotes from LaPoe come from Mark through Old Testament eyes. This is the most recent of the ones out here. So just particularly focusing on the Old Testament background of New Testament books. That's what this series does. So these are where the LaPoe quotes came from. But that will conclude our walk through Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse. Now, there are two other versions of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew's version and Luke's version. We've looked at those, but we haven't done, we've only gone like verse by verse through Mark's, because Mark's is sort of the one that the others build around and adapt in different ways. If you'd like to see a walkthrough of this level of detail for Matthew 24, which is Matthew's version, or Luke 21 and parts of Luke 17, which is where Luke's version is found, that'd be something I'd be open to if there's enough interest in it. You might be Olivet discoursed out at this point, and totally get that. We're going to go back to, in the immediate future, I'm going to get back to teaching through some more of the Psalms. We stopped at around Psalm 21. So we're going to pick back up in the Psalms teaching series, but I'm not at all opposed to doing another series like this through Matthew 24 or Luke 21, if that's something that viewers would find interesting. So if you would, let me know in the comment section below. Again, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, hopefully by now you've at least realized that it's worth supporting with your subscription. And when you do, tap the little notifications icon. And again, if you're a Disciple Dojo donor of any dollar amount and you want a patch, all you got to do, email me through the contact form on the website. Tell me which color you want, light or dark, and I'll happily send one of those to you. But thank you guys, those of you that have watched, that have tuned in. Thousands of people have watched videos about the Olivet Discourse that get into Greek and obscure passages and long form teaching, and that's just awesome. And so I'm really thankful. That'll do for now. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more. And you know what I'm going to tell you guys, as always, keep training.